All right, so let's take a look at the structure of cyclohexane one more time. This time we're going to look at every single carbon along the cyclohexane chain. And the idea is that we basically can start anywhere we want on the ring, but from that point forward, you have to keep everything consistent. So we'll try to make a few things clear so that you have a concise way of drawing these 3D structures. So first things first, when you have your chair configuration, if the corners, you could call them the vertices, if they are pointing down, so in this case, look at this line going down, and that one's also going down to the same point. If this point, the corner, if you will, is pointing down, you draw a line straight down. If on the other hand, the corner is pointing up, like in this case of this carbon, the bond is going upwards, and from the right side, the bond is also going upwards, you draw a line straight up. So for every single carbon that you see here where the point is upwards, you have that straight up line. And where the point is going downwards, you have the bond going straight down. This is what we call the axial bonds. And based on the previous video, it's important to recognize that axial bonds don't necessarily coincide with being trans or being cis, because depending on what spot of the cyclohexane you decide to place your substituents, the story may change a little bit. What will not change, however, is the fact that if you have a ball bond, that particular group will have to be above a hydrogen, and if you have a dash bond, that group will have to be below a hydrogen. That will never change. But your axial bonds are probably the easiest to draw, because all you have to look at is whether your carbon here is pointing up or if it's pointing down. If it points up, draw the bond up. If it's pointing down, draw the bond down. So these are the axial bonds. Now the ones that get drawn to complete the tetrahedral structure are known as the equatorial bonds. And we're going to start with the ones on the extremes, the ones on the carbon farthest to the left and the carbon farthest to the right. Notice that here you cannot draw the bonds pointing semi in the direction that these bonds are going. They're both going up. So this one also goes up, but instead of going to the right, it goes to the left to complete the tetrahedral structure. And right here, these bonds, kind of mimicking what's going on here on the cyclohexane, these bonds are technically going down from the point of view of this carbon. So this bond also goes down, but instead of going down to the left, it goes down and to the right, and you complete your tetrahedral structure. Then the carbons right here, in a similar fashion, these bonds are technically going up from the point of view of this carbon, so this bond goes up. These bonds are going down from the point of view of this carbon, so the bond right here also goes down, but it always in the opposite direction. So these ones go down technically to the front of this carbon, so this one goes down to the back. These ones go up to the back of this carbon, so the bond that you draw right here is up but to the front. And the ones that are a little bit tricky are the ones that I left out to last. This one's right here, right in the middle. Technically, you want to draw them so you kind of have that tetrahedral structure, but sometimes it makes it a little bit confusing, because what ends up happening if you draw this just a little bit wrong is that you end up with this equatorial bond pointing straight down, or that equatorial bond pointing straight up, and you have to be very careful not to do that, because you will confuse yourself and you might actually think you're dealing with the axial bond when in fact that was the equatorial. But the idea right here is kind of similar. These bonds, from the point of view of this carbon, the bonds in the cyclohexane are going down, so this one also goes down, but it has to be at an angle. Notice that from the premise of this axial bond, we have an angle between it, right? So you have to draw it off to the side, and the same thing here. Draw it off to the side, and this, once again, the carbon right here, in respect to it, the cyclohexane bonds are pointing up. So this bond also points up, but it has to be at an angle so that it doesn't look like an axial bond. All right, so this is the key premise of how to draw all the bonds. And like I mentioned earlier, you could start anywhere on this cyclohexane, as long as you keep that idea that bold bonds represent a group that is above the hydrogen and dash bonds represent groups that are below the hydrogen. Now, the other thing to also keep in mind, and this is perhaps just as important, is that this structure has a 3D aspect to it. And right here, what I'm kind of highlighting in red is the front portion of the molecule. So in essence, what I'm tracing right now in the molecule, including that red bond, is what we would consider the front part of the molecule. And the blue part right here is what we consider the back portion of the molecule. And I'm going to trace all the bonds to, technically speaking, correspond to the back of the molecule. So it's very important that you keep this in mind, because what I'm about to show you relies on the idea that you know what's on the front and what's on the back. And just to make it also a little bit simpler, the carbon farthest to the left and the carbon farthest to the right on the cyclohexane ring are technically in the middle. They're not at the front, they're not at the back, they're right on the plane. Okay, but this is at the front and the blue stuff here is at the back. All right, so we'll keep that in mind when trying to draw a molecule. So this is the deal. Instead of giving you a structure, I could give you a name, like in the case shown right here, cis-1-ethyl 2-methyl cyclohexane, and I could ask you to draw the 3D structure, the chair conformation of the cyclohexane molecule. And you could start first by drawing the 2D form of this molecule. It's the cis configuration, so both bonds have to be on the same side, meaning that they both have to be bold or they both have to be dash. So in this case, I'm just going with the bold bond. Ethyl is at position 1, so if this carbon, we call it carbon 1, that's the ethyl group. At position 2, we have methyl. So now notice I'm going clockwise in this setup, right? So ethyl is at position 1, methyl is at position 2, and I'm just basically going clockwise. This is a little bit subjective, I would say, but I prefer to do it this way. It's going clockwise the entire time. So what happens is that when you take the structure onto the 3D framework, you can choose the ethyl group to be on any one of these carbons on the cyclohexane. Now the premise, however, is that because the bond is bold, this ethyl group must be above the hydrogen, no matter where you place it on the cyclohexane. So I'm going to choose the carbon right here. And for that carbon, the only bonds available are this equatorial bond and the axial bond. I want the ethyl group to be above the hydrogen, so I have to place the ethyl group on the axial bond so that it remains above the hydrogen. Now, you could have just as easily put the ethyl group on the carbon right here or the carbon up there, pretty much any of the other 5 carbons. It's completely up to you where you place it. But the moment you place that first substituent on carbon 1 on the cyclohexane chair conformation, you have to make sure that everything is consistent. So here is why I'm saying that you have to keep in mind that this is going to go clockwise, because we're really going to look at this thing as going clockwise. And the idea is that you want to look at the molecule from the top down, because technically speaking, looking at the 2D picture is you looking at this 3D structure from the top down. So meaning that if you look at the title of the slide and you work your way down, that's how you're looking at it. So going clockwise means that we're going to go from the ethyl group right here, which is on this carbon, to the next carbon over, which is the one right here. So hopefully you get that idea of going clockwise like this. Now, if we're going to end up with the methyl group on position 2, which is technically this position, and the methyl needs to be above the hydrogen, notice that the axial bond points down and the equatorial bond technically is above it. So the only way to have the methyl group above the hydrogen is to have the methyl group in the equatorial position. And notice that here, axial, equatorial doesn't really mean anything in terms of you being trans or cis, but what that's definitely play a role is the fact that the ethyl group is above the hydrogen and the methyl group is above the hydrogen in both of these scenarios. All right, now just to give you another example, let's say that we picked the carbon right here to place the ethyl. Now in this case, the ethyl has to be in the equatorial position because that's the only way to have ethyl group above the hydrogen group, right, as it's required by the bold bond. Now, the methyl group is still at position 2, and we're still following this clockwise pathway along the molecule. So if we start at this carbon, we have to follow this clockwise pattern still. And what that means is that we start here, position 2 is going to be the one on the front, that appears right here in the middle. And so this is position 2 in respect to position 1 being here. And since we want the methyl to be above the hydrogen, we have to make sure that the methyl group ends up on the axial bond, right? It's methyl above hydrogen, ethyl above hydrogen. And this is technically the same molecule. In essence, this is no different than what we had before, except that we have just rotated the molecule on its own axis. That's really all that's happened. But as you can see, where you choose to place the ethyl initially doesn't matter, but from that point forward, everything has to remain consistent. And to keep it consistent, just go clockwise along the cyclohexane 2D structure. All right, now at the end, you don't need to put all these other bonds. All you need is just the 2 substituents, and your hydrogens, and you're good to go. All right, now let's do another example. Trans 1-bromo 3 ethoxy cyclohexane. So this is your ether functional, well, it's not really a functional group in this case, more like a substituent, but that's your ether substituent, and this is your bromo substituent. Starting with the 2D structure, if we select this once again as position 1, that's where we place the bromo substituent. At position 3, we have ethoxy, so we have 1, 2, and 3, so that's where ethoxy goes. And since this is trans, one needs to be bold, the other one needs to be dash. Okay, so here comes the skeletal framework for the cyclohexane structure. You can pick whichever carbon you want to have the bromine, which will be position 1. So I'm going to pick position 1 to be right here, just because. And since the bromine has a bold bond, the bromine needs to be above the hydrogen as it is currently, right? So we have bromine above the hydrogen. Now position 3, so we have to go clockwise, 1, 2, and 3. So if this is position 1, going clockwise means that we continue being on the front, going in this direction. So this is position 2. And then we move over to this other carbon. This is position 3. Now over here, the ethoxy group needs to be below the hydrogen. Therefore, we draw the ethoxy group on the axial bond in respect to the hydrogen. And as you can see here, bromine is above the hydrogen, ethoxy is below the hydrogen. This is a trans configuration. All right, let's do another one. Cis-1 isobutyl for propyl cyclohexane. We can start by drawing the cyclohexane molecule in 2D. This is the cis configuration, and this time around, just for the sake of variety, I'm choosing the dash bonds, right? But both of them have to be dash since this is the cis configuration. And I'm also abbreviating the isobutyl with a superscript I followed by BU, right? So isobutyl, and then PR for propyl. So once again, we start with the cyclohexane structure, and you want to go clockwise, right? So isobutyl is in position 1. This one is position 4. If we pick isobutyl to be located right on this carbon, since we want isobutyl to be below hydrogen as a result of having that dash bond, we place the isobutyl on the equatorial bond in this particular position, right? So isobutyl below hydrogen. Now position 4, if we go clockwise, this is 1, that's 2, that's 3, this is 4. We also want propyl to be below the hydrogen. And the bonds that you draw is axial completely down, and then you have your equatorial going slightly up, but to the left. So you have to place your propyl group below the hydrogen, right? So in the axial position. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of how to draw your cyclohexane structures. In the next lecture that we're going to look at later, we're going to get into a lot more detail about it. In fact, we'll look at the energy differences of slightly different conformations of that structure. But in the next video, we're going to talk about a series of cycloalkanes that have fused rings known as bicycloalkanes. So I'll see you in the next video.